glorious the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is filled with his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. And then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth, and he said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? This is Isaiah's call as a prophet. Then I said, Here am I. Send me. In this passage, we see from Isaiah two primary images of God that he picks up that I believe shape his whole ministry. The first one is that he is blown away by the power of God. He describes this scene where the God is high and lifted up and his train fills the whole temple. And the voice that announces God is so powerful that the foundations are shaken, the foundations of heaven by this voice. This mighty image of God as the powerful one. And then obviously the other image that we see is that God is holy. And angels are bowed before him, crying out in adoration, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. Those two lessons form the basis of Isaiah's ministry. The first lesson we learn is that Isaiah learned is that God's holiness reveals our sinfulness. Whenever in the Bible you see a human interact with an angel appears, what's the human do? They fall flat on their face in front of the angel. Why? Because when we see an angel, they appear to us to be the most holy, the most pure thing we could possibly imagine. And so many times angels have had to say, don't bow before me, only worship God. Because people are confused, right? Well, even angels, even these pure, holy, brilliant white beings are on their faces before God as he is so radiant and so powerful and beautiful in his holiness, that they are in adoration looking up at the throne and saying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. Wow. Even an angel in the throne room of heaven is just blown away, is bowled away by the brilliant holiness of God. What's Isaiah's response when he says that? He says, I shouldn't be here because I have unclean lips. I'm from a people of unclean lips. Why does he say that? Because when we're confronted with the purity of God's holiness, we come to realize anything in us that is still sinful, that is still inadequate. We're guilty of being people who try to measure ourselves against other people instead of the standard of God's holiness, aren't we? Well, I'm not racist, because look at that person. Look how racist they are. So I'm not racist. I'm not prejudiced. Well, I'm not full of lust because I'm not doing this that this person does. I don't have this problem because I don't do what this person does. But when we measure ourselves not against other people, but against the purity of God's holiness. Oh, I do a pretty good job loving my family, because at least I don't physically abuse them. At least I don't do this like this guy does. It's when we measure ourselves against the beauty and the purity of God's holiness and God's love that we realize, wow, I still have work to do. And I would propose every time I hear someone imply that they are fully grown in holiness and they don't have holiness left to achieve, my response isn't, wow, look at how holy they are. My response is, wow, they need to look at God. To get a fresh view of how much further we all have to develop in the area of holiness as we increasingly try to reflect the holiness and the purity and the love of our Creator. We come up with our own standards of good behavior. You know, when we knock on the doors to present the gospel to people, Pastor Peter and I were out last week beating on doors. Not beating on doors, walking down the sidewalk and praying with people as we passed by. Almost every person you pass believes they're a pretty good person. How's your relationship with God? Well, I'm a pretty good person. I don't do things that are too terrible. I'm not as bad as my neighbor. He cuts his grass and sprays it into my lawn. I'm not as bad as that guy. What a clown. There's coming a day when we're going to be standing before the Holy One, being measured against the standard of holiness that we cannot achieve, but by the grace of God through the blood of Jesus Christ. And that calls us to be people who are living in the grace of God, who are living in the love and the provision of God by walking in the Spirit, by living in Christ, and by increasingly seeking to reflect His holiness to a world that needs to see it. Because let me remind you, the church needs to be demonstrating holiness and love to the world right now more than any other time. They need to see from us a people who are full of love, who are full of compassion, who are full of willingness to understand another person's perspective. Not the people who are violently and passionately standing for our own rights and standing for our own point of view, but people who are full of love and who are full of understanding, seeking to understand other people. That's what our world needs to see as we reflect the character and the beauty of God. God help us to stand out from the world as the good guys. God help us. How does that work for Isaiah? How does this idea work for Isaiah? Well, Isaiah goes from the vision of God to proclaim God's message to Jerusalem. And what's he say to them? He says, God's wrath is coming on you because you are not holy. Your little sacrifices, your little ditties you do at the altar don't make you holy before a holy God, because I've seen what a holy God looks like. And so Isaiah chapter 10 verse 3. What will you do on the day of punishment, he asks, in the ruin that will come from afar? To whom will you flee for help, and where will you leave your wealth? Nothing remains but to crouch among the prisoners or fall among the slain. Jerusalem, there is judgment that's coming to you because you've come up short. You've been sinful. Isaiah does not make allowances for sin because he's seen God's holiness and he knows that Jerusalem has come up short. The second lesson we learn is that God's power renders other powers moot, like a moot point. It doesn't matter. God's power is so powerful that it renders these other powers moot. Have you ever been pinned to your seat by a 900 horsepower engine in a sports car that was pedal to the metal? And if you had wanted to pick up that penny off the dash, you couldn't have reached up and grabbed that penny. How many of you have had that experience? Maybe not 900 horsepower, but a whole bunch of G's pushing you back into your seat. Oh, it feels good, doesn't it? How many of you have ever sat in the cockpit of a machine where you pulled a lever and all of a sudden a big hunk of dirt was scooped out of the ground that saved you, if you had done it with a shovel and a wheelbarrow, saved you hours of work just by pulling the right levers? How many of you have had that experience? A bunch of us, right? Man, I love the first time I got in my dad's Bobcat. And that's not some huge machine, but man, it saved me a lot of work. It did a lot of work really fast. Once you've experienced power, once you've pulled a lever and seen that much dirt scooped up, it's hard to pick up a shovel and a wheelbarrow again, right? If you have a big job that needs to be done. Once you've stood in the ocean and you've been bowled over by a massive wave that came in, you never again think that you're stronger than the waves in the ocean. Can you identify with that? Once you've experienced power, anything less than that is revealed for what it is. Isaiah got a glimpse of God's power, and that affected how he saw the situations in his world. Chapter 3, verse 1. The Lord of hosts is sending his punishment. Nothing can stand before it. The mighty man, the soldier, the captain of 50, they are all going to be taken away. Jerusalem is powerless to withstand God's wrath. By the way, it's going to be Assyria that executes God's wrath. And so the natural understanding would be, well, I guess then we ought to fear Assyria. God says, no, you shouldn't even fear Assyria. Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 12. Do not call conspiracy all that these people call conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread. But the Lord of hosts, him you shall honor as holy. Let him be your fear. Let him be your dread. Don't be scared of little Assyria. God is the one. God is the puppet master. He's the one that you should be afraid of. In fact, in chapter 10, we see that Assyria is going to overstep as instruments of God in executing his wrath against Jerusalem. And so God's going to come back and say, Assyria, I'm going to punish you because you went further than I told you were allowed to go. Chapters 13 through 24, all these other nations, God proves that he is the God of the whole world because he's going to judge this nation, he's going to judge this nation. He is the one who has all power. Jerusalem, don't turn to Egypt for help. They can't help you. Turn to God because I saw God. I was in his temple. I looked at him. He's the one who is powerful. Don't turn to these other nations for help. Don't ask northern Israel to help you against the invading armies. They can't help you. Only God can help you. He's the one who has all power. He's the 900 horsepower engine. He's the ocean. He's that powerful one that is more powerful than anything you've ever experienced. Hezekiah makes that mistake in chapter 9. He turns to Babylon in chapter 39 for help. And then he welcomes them into the temple. He shows them the treasures in Jerusalem. And what does Isaiah, how does he respond? He says, that was really, really foolish. Because now you've shown them that you're wealthy. They're going to come back and take your wealth. That was foolish. You should have trusted God, not in Babylon. Chapters 36 and 37 exemplify this reality, that God is the most powerful one. Have you ever heard of Sennacherib? I've talked about him before. Sennacherib is one of my favorite Bible characters. Not as a positive example, but as a negative example. Sennacherib is from Assyria. He's a great, I believe he's the king, but he's also the general of the army, and he's going out from Assyria, and he's conquering all these other nations on his way to Jerusalem because he's going to put them in their place. They stopped sending him tribute. He's not okay with this. He's going to conquer them. And so Sennacherib, I believe I have my story right. Sennacherib, Bill will tell me if I don't. Thanks, Bill. Appreciate you. Sennacherib comes in, and he besieges Jerusalem. He surrounds them. He cuts off their supply lines. And he starts mocking them. Jerusalem, you're pitiful, you're tiny, you can't stand before me. Hey, you should call Egypt for help. Better yet, don't. They're a broken reed. They're a bunch of little weenies down there. They can't help you. Egypt can't help you. Your God can't help you. Isaiah 36:18, he says, beware lest Hezekiah mislead you by saying the Lord will deliver us. Has any of the gods of the nations delivered his land out of the hand of Assyria? Where are all these other gods? Who among all the gods of these lands have delivered their lands? That the Lord should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand. In other words, I'm bigger than your walls. I'm bigger than your king. I'm bigger than your God. Nothing can stand before me. Hezekiah, the king at this time, reaches out to Isaiah and says, Isaiah, you got to help me out. Give me a message. Give me something. Isaiah responds with a message of encouragement, with a message of God's power. Listen to Hezekiah's prayer in Isaiah 37:16. O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, enthroned above the cherubim, you are the God, you alone of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and the earth. Hezekiah expresses his faith in God. God responds and says, I'm going to take care of business. Assyria? Sennacherib? Never heard of her. I'm the God of the nations. I am the God of the universe. The angel of the Lord comes, even as Sennacherib is encamped out there outside of Jerusalem. The angel of the Lord goes out there and wipes out a bunch of Sennacherib's men, and Sennacherib goes back to Assyria with his tail between his legs in shame. He gets back to Assyria, and his own sons kill him. They kill this shameful, returning, conquering general that couldn't even conquer Jerusalem. Why? Because Sennacherib thought he could stand before the one who was high and lifted up in heaven, that Isaiah had seen as the all-powerful God of the universe. Friends, every once in a while, I believe we need to be reminded of just how powerful God is. We fret away on our knees, and that's what we're supposed to do in prayer. We're supposed to pray and take our request to God. But week after week after week, we take the same request to God and say, God, I hope you're capable of doing something with this. I hope you can actually make a difference in our world. God, look at this virus that's in our nation. God, look at these racial tensions and this inequity that's in our nation. God, maybe you can do something about it. So here's another prayer I'll give you, and let's see if you come through. Every once in a while, we need to see God high and lifted up, all powerful on the throne of the universe, and recognize that the nations are in his hand. And he can turn the hearts of rulers, he can turn the hearts of people, and he can bring restoration and healing, he can bring justice and equity, he can accomplish his will, and through his church and through his mighty power demonstrated in our world. We need to sometimes remember just how powerful a God we have. I know you're getting hot. I know service needs to be over soon for your own safety. But I want to move on to point 3. If you have your handout, I want to move on to point 3. So Isaiah has seen God high and lifted up. He's seen him as powerful. He's seen him as holy. And his last message for Israel is this: that yes, you are going to return from exile. I keep getting out of your camera angle, brother. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I keep pacing back and forth. Yes, you are going to return from exile, but God is going to set up a new Jerusalem. The old Jerusalem had a purpose. It had a reason it existed. God gave Jerusalem a calling to be the light to the nations, and it failed miserably. And so God is going to set up a new Jerusalem to be a light to the nations. They will return from exile. But this new Jerusalem won't be subject to the sins of its leaders. It will fulfill what God envisioned for Jerusalem. It will light the world. All of the other nations will come together under its blessing and protection. God is going to establish his reign on earth, a reign of peace and prosperity. How many of you would love for Jesus to set up a reign of peace on this earth right now? Wouldn't that be beautiful? This nation, this new Jerusalem will light the world. God is going to establish this rule. He's going to judge righteously in chapter 32. In chapter 34, he's going to execute his judgment on the sins of the nation. There are sins in our nation that need to be judged. There are sins across our world that need to be judged. He's going to judge those. In chapter 3, the nations will come. All the nations will come to this new Jerusalem. The king will settle their disputes. Oh, I'd love to be able to travel to go see King Jesus right now and say, hey, Jesus, set us all straight, would you? Would you just fix us? That's going to happen someday. He's going to sit on the throne. He's going to judge the nations and say, hey, you got it wrong. Hey, you, fix this in the way that you think. Y'all need to get along a little bit better. Chapter 9 tells us his name, this king in Jerusalem, his name is going to be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. I like this new Jerusalem. How many of you, this sounds like a pretty good place to you? I love it. How is this kingdom going to be brought in? Isaiah prophesies about this figure, this servant, who's going to initiate this kingdom, but he's not going to do it like Sennacherib did when he went out and conquered. This servant is going to initiate this kingdom through suffering. What in the world? Why would this servant need to suffer in order to initiate a kingdom? Well, the people are sinful. In chapter 1, their sins are like scarlet, and they need to be made white as snow. In chapter 43, God offers to blot out their transgressions, but how is he going to do it? In chapter 5, he's going to take their punishment. It says, I gave my back to those who strike and my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from disgrace and spitting. Does anybody know who the servant is yet? Have you figured it out? In chapter 53, the servant will grow up like a tender plant. He won't have any form or majesty or any particular beauty. No, he's going to be a man of sorrows and well acquainted with grief. He's going to be despised. But oh, he's going to bear our griefs. He's going to carry our sorrows, Isaiah says. He's going to offer us forgiveness, the cleansing of sins. He will be pierced for our transgressions. He will be crushed for our iniquities. Jerusalem, Judea, we're like a bunch of sheep who have gone astray. We've all turned to our own way. We've sinned against the God of heaven. But God is going to lay on the back of this suffering servant the iniquity of everybody. He's going to carry that on his own shoulders. He's going to be led like a lamb to the slaughter. He's going to bear their iniquities so that they, the sinful ones, can be counted righteous. And I'm not preaching New Testament right now. I'm preaching Isaiah. Isaiah offers the benefits of this atonement not just to Israel, not just to God's chosen people, but listen to this in Isaiah 54:5. He says, "For your Maker is your husband, the Lord of hosts is his name, and the Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. The God of the whole earth he is called." This redemption will be offered to everyone. Isaiah is called the evangelistic prophet because he evangelizes to the nations. God is the king of the whole world. All nations are invited to come into this new Jerusalem and enjoy the blessings of living under God's provision. And that's the prophecy of Isaiah. Isn't that super cool? I'm so glad that Isaiah lived. I'm so glad Isaiah had the Isaiah chapter 6 experience so that he could tell us about the holiness and the power of God, and so that he could tell us about the day when the suffering servant was going to come to offer you and you and you and you and you salvation and forgiveness. If it wasn't 96 degrees, you'd be excited about it too. Go home and listen to the sermon again, and maybe you'll shout like I'm shouting up here. The reason we have the perspective that Isaiah gives us, though, is because of Isaiah 6. And I want to bring it to a close with this. Fathers, you can see yourselves a lot of different ways, and a lot of those